and welcome to the BabaYaga project. This week we won't be opening with a story, as we are focusing on aspects of Indigenous culture, and since neither myself nor Devin are Indigenous, it would feel inappropriate to use Indigenous voices in that way.
Today we're going to discuss the green corn ceremony and place it into a historical context. We definitely hope that you listen to this episode, but understand if you would rather hear from Indigenous voices speaking to this and other First Nations cultures. I have a few podcasts you can turn to if you would like to hear from Indigenous women. The first is All My Relations by Adrienne Keene of Native Appropriations. She's a member of the Cherokee Nation, and Matika Wilbur, who is Swinomish and Tulalip. It's a podcast about Indigenous culture, food, fashion, writing, etc. Another one of my personal favorites is The Secret Life of Canada, which is about sort of all things Canadian, and is hosted by Phelan Johnson of the Mohawk and Tuscarora Nations, and Leah Simone Bowen, who is a first-generation Canadian whose family is from Barbados. Another is Unreserved from the CBC journalist Rosanna Deerchild, and it's stories and culture from across Turtle Island. So we really hope that you check out those podcasts as well. They're some of my favorites and really highlight Indigenous culture from an Indigenous perspective. Another thing I just wanted to lay out is that we're going to be talking about Indigenous religious ceremonies today, which is always difficult when talking about it in English because language is so shaped by the culture that it develops in. So some of the phrases, like with the previous episode that I did when we were talking about nations, like those are rough approximations of what the ideas really are in totality. So we're going to use the closest words that we have in English to describe how these cultures conceive of a religious world and ceremony, and do the best that we can with the language that we're speaking in.
So, Devin, just throw a medievalist a bone here. What is the green corn ceremony? Just an overview for someone who doesn't know anything about it.
Okay. So the green corn ceremony is a often 4-day-long festival or religious ceremony practiced specifically by the nations of the Southeast North America. So we're thinking of Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, the Seminole, etc., all of those sort of from what is now known as North Carolina through Georgia, parts of Alabama, Tennessee kind of area. It begins with the harvest of the first green corn. So that's usually July or early August. And it'll start specifically on the first full moon after the first corn harvest. And it's the sort of the signal of a new year, the renewal of energy and health in the land and in the people. And it's really a sort of ceremony of thanksgiving for the bounty that's being harvested, and a way of establishing a balance between, the various sort of realms that exist in what you might call a theology of these cultures. So the underworld, the upper world, and the plane that humans live on. And there's differing animals that live in those different worlds and the sort of spirits of those animals. Yeah.
Right, because you said this is the first of the kind of the new crop that's coming in, right?
Yes. So the first green corn is the corn that you can eat. Green corn is the corn that you can eat right after cooking it. And then later in the harvest, or if you want to keep corn for longer, you have to dry it and then process it. So it might become a corn flour or meal. And you would store that over the winter to, continue eating until the new crop is here. But the fresh corn is really, that's what, we would normally eat, corn on the cob. It's really good, sweet, sort of delicious corn.
Okay, so this is sort of, I mean, you're saying that these are, these ideas of renewal and, a new year and that sort of thing, and that, the coming together of these different sort of planes, as you were saying, and it's, so, I mean, corn is the staple crop, like, that's the crop that can be stored long term.
Yeah, so there wasn't ever...
But,
yeah,
like...
so there wasn't wheat in North America.
Right.
So corn was domesticated in southern Mexico about 9,000 years ago, and it moved up... Sorry, my cat's making noise. It moved up along, like, 3 different routes to North America, where it became a staple crop, and was a staple crop there, and in Mexico, and in South America, all these places that it was sort of brought by trade between various nations to the southeast, where it became super, super important to the culture and life of the people.
Right, because that would be, like the kind of food that you can eat through the winter, because it can dry out. It's not like a vegetable. It's not going to go, like, rotten very easily.
No, and you can
so
grind it down to make, like, a meal, or to make bread with it. So
yeah, so it's like a very versatile ingredient to work with.
Which is why now it's,
and, like, good
in
for storage.
Absolutely everything. So
no, that makes sense. So do you want to then, kind of jumping off of that, talk about, I mean, obviously it has a lot of, like, physical significance of, like, this is the food that we're eating, the dried corn gets us through the winter, and then in the summer we can eat this sweet fresh corn again. But, what are the kind of religious or cultural sort of things that come up around the corn then?
Yeah, so I'm going to point to a couple of anthropologists and theologians when I talk about this. Corn was such an integral staple to the sort of pre-contact Southeast that it really affects the entire understanding of the world and humanity's place in it, and how, like, survival sort of exists. And even if you look at what are sort of the, like, foundational sacred stories of the Muskogee Creek and the Cherokee in particular, corn features super prominently. So if you go all the way back to the sort of, like, Genesis story, you have, like, an earth diver story where an animal dives down into the ocean to bring earth up to the surface for an eagle or another creature, serpent, to, build the land from. And then from that you have these sort of first peoples that are spiritual beings, and that's where you get the story of the Corn Mother or the Corn Maiden, sort of depending on which story is popular in that particular culture, because there's a few variations on it. So the story of the Corn Mother is essentially that she's depicted as, like, an old woman who comes to the aid of a hungry community and often adopts children, and she, from her body, produces corn, but she does it secretly, and one of the adopted sons will see it and mistake it for, like, this dark magic and make these plans to kill her. And because she's, like, this spiritual being, she'll know that this is coming and, like, confront them, not being able to stop them from killing her, but confront them and give them the knowledge of how the corn is harvested, and then they'll kill her and bury her, and corn will grow from that place, and she will have, like, passed down the knowledge of how to tend the corn. And that's, like, the story of where the corn comes from, but it's this deep connection to the land and to these spiritual beings and to animals, and this... Sorry, my cat's knocking things over now. it's a story of connection to the land and to spiritual beings and to other animals, as well as to this process of dying and rebirth. So it's really this like regenerative story where the energy that you put into the land is what you get back, and that something has to be sacrificed in order to gain something, right? You can't just have like perpetual growth, essentially. And that the message of that story is also taken into how animals and hunting and all of these other things are treated, and into who can practice agriculture, because especially with the Cherokee, women were the growers, the farmers, essentially, while men hunted. And both of those were thought of as like sacred practices. And then there's another
Right.
story where it's a young, beautiful woman who marries a man in a community that's suffering from hunger. She also, in the same way, produces corn from her body, and she's discovered, and again, it's mistaken for this like black magic, and she flees and returns to her like spiritual home, but her husband comes with her and she shows him how to grow the corn, and he comes back to his family and teaches them, but again she has to leave. So something has to be lost in order to gain something, which is why when you look at the ceremony, it's really a ceremony of death and regeneration. So the ending of one year
Right,
going into
so
a new year.
right. No, and that makes, this idea of there needing to be that balance is really really interesting, right? Like the idea that you need to give something up um in order to gain something.
Yeah, and it's really about this like this balance, but also that this is a process of Thanksgiving, that there is a sacred and ritualized way to thank what is being lost so that you can gain. There's similar sort of like particular ceremonies and rituals around eating animals as well, and how an animal's body is to be used, and that like if you don't use the animal in that particular way, if you don't give it the thanks that its spirit deserves, the animals can enact illness onto people, which this makes a
Oh
special
wow.
sense considering that there wasn't a whole lot of human to human communicable diseases pre-contact in North America.
Right.
So this idea that you would get illness from ill-prepared meat, and the spiritual content of that really makes a lot of sense when we look back on it. But that idea pervades sort of everything. So how much corn you can grow, how much land you can use for growing the corn, how much land you can use for hunting, how many animals you can take during your hunt. It's really about this balance, and the green corn ceremony is the largest of these like balancing ceremonies. And if you look at sort of the theology of how the world is divided into, in modern thought, what we would think of as like the spiritual planes or something like that, in this like modern Western verbiage, the humans are created last, right? And so the animals and these spiritual beings that create the plants, like corn, have more knowledge than people do, but people are given this sort of job to keep balance between these various worlds. So the upper world, where birds have power, and the underworld, where it's like fish and serpents, and then also on the land, and that the land can be this pathway between these worlds. Humans have to control that balance and keep things in balance, or it might become diseased, or you might, get the ire of one of these more powerful spiritual beings. So it's very much about like respect
Yeah.
to the energies that have to be gained and lost in order to get food and sustenance, which is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also very that connection between it's, whether it is a mother or a maiden, that it's like this female figure who is necessary for corn to be there. And then, as you were saying, that then it's the women who would be responsible for the farming, sort of as that, like, again, in that sort of, that balance of things.
And if you look at the corn mother story, in some of the stories, the sons, she's called Selu in Cherokee. So if Selu, the corn mother, when she's found out, and her sons kill her, in some of the stories, they drag her body around the fields, and wherever it is that her blood spills, the corn grows, which is another like powerful symbology of, these universal stories of like, or symbols of womanhood in this, the like transference of blood and through the body to the earth.
Yeah, and I mean this, I mean, the connection of women, when women give birth, the blood of the menstrual cycle, and now also, this idea of sort of her blood fertilizing and making the earth able to grow things.
It's one of those very ancient and like timeless ideas.
Yeah, so getting into some of the more specifics now, I did want to, ask where and by whom exactly is this being practiced, and what do these rites and rituals and ceremonies look like?
So the nations that practice a green corn ceremony are the Southeast nations, which are now also in Oklahoma. So we're looking at the Cherokee, the Creeker Muskogee, the Seminole, etc. Everyone sort of, I mean, not everyone, but the larger nations from what's now known as North Carolina, Tennessee, down to Georgia, Alabama border. These were people who lived on incredibly fertile land, so they were able to really have, sort of like permanent settlements with permanent agriculture, because the land is so well irrigated and very fertile, especially for things like corn. These crops that really take a lot, like cotton, corn, things like that. It would also be like a major reason for the American states' removal of these nations to Oklahoma, which deeply affects this ceremony. In some cases, sort of removing it from its context entirely.
Right, because it's a land-based ceremony.
Yes, yeah, and this was a huge trauma that we can talk about a little later in the podcast when we really talk about, how the, genocidal war acts of the American state really affect this ceremony in particular when the nations are removed to Oklahoma, and how the land there is so different that the traditional practices of agriculture no longer produce the same food, right? Yeah. Oklahoma just can't grow the same crops in the same way as these very fertile river basins in Georgia in particular. So it's super tragic. Not only does the Trail of Tears really destroy a culture by killing, not destroy, it's obviously still exists, but has an irreversible effect on a culture because of so many people who are lost along the way, but also then to come to a new place, one, outside of a planting season, but two, into a land that you don't understand, that you don't have the cultural knowledge of that land to be able to farm it in the way that you were farming before, really, I mean, it causes this whole long period of starvation for the Cherokee and the Creek in particular that causes deep, just horrifying generational traumas within those nations and affects the way that the ceremonies are practiced.
Right. So, just to back up a bit, do we want to talk about sort of what these ceremonies looked like, or what we know about these ceremonies, what they would have been like pre-contact? And
Yeah,
then
so
kind of do a compare and contrast, I guess.
Well, so I don't really have a compare and contrast. What I can tell you is like most of the knowledge that we have of the rites and rituals are from documentation from the 18th century into the early 19th century before removal.
Okay.
So, and then we can talk later about the ways that they're being practiced now and the context in which they're being practiced, because it's a little bit different.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, so in that case, I guess I want to know then, what is this looking like, at least according to the documents we have from, 18th, 19th century?
Yeah, so looking at those specifically, that's where most of the documentation that I have, which are secondary sources, are of a 4-day festival where a sacred square is built, and it's outside of where people are living, right? So everybody comes to where this square has been established and build campsites on the first day, like these lodges that are specifically positioned, and the site of where the new fire would be built is created. And then, so on the first day, everything's sort of set up, and then what you would have is a stickball game, which is also practiced by the Haudenosaunee in the lands that we're currently recording this on, which is it's a similar game throughout the East Coast that is the basis for what becomes lacrosse, right?
Right.
So that's what would look familiar to you.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So a stickball game would be played amongst the men, and then there would be a feast of the last of the previous year's dried corn. And after the feast, everyone, but especially the men, would fast. So no food or water until the green corn feast that happens at sort of the height of the ceremony.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's where you have, and all of the fires and all of the lodges are put out. It's the beginning of this cleansing ritual. So the first day is really this process of taking everything from the year before apart, mm-hmm. to then be cleansed and rebuilt throughout the rest of the festival.
Okay. So then you said this was 4 days long. So mm-hmm. What's the second day looking like?
So the second day is the day of the women's dance. So this is the women's ribbon dance. These are also called stomp dances. So you've probably seen images of the ribbon dance. The biggest feature is that the women wear leggings that have traditionally empty tortoise shells tied to them, and these long ribbons. And as they dance and sort of, when you stomp your feet into the ground, the rattling creates the rhythm of the dance, and the ribbons sort of fly around. And they carry willow branches to gather the prayers of the people and sort of usher in this cleansing spiritual process. And after that dance, then the new ceremonial fire is lit in the middle of the square on these I guess it's 4 logs that are set up so that they coordinate with the 4 cardinal directions. And the willows are used in particular because the willow trees are associated with the water, so it's this link between the land and the water, which the water is seen as the sort of lifeblood of the earth, right?
Right.
So
yeah, that makes sense that it's sort of this coming together of, like the land and the fire and the water.
Yeah. So similar to a lot of practices across the world, this joining of elements and directions. And so then the fire is lit using the willows that have been used in the dance with these prayers. Also, some of the green corn and other sacred items would be placed in the fire as offering to, the other worlds.
Right.
And then later that fire will be used to then light all of the hearths again. So, this is a time period where you would keep a fire going all year round, 24/7. So what happens when Green Corn Festival starts is you put out all of the fires, and then this new fire, this new clean fire, this rejuvenated fire is used to then light all of the hearths again.
Oh. Yeah, so it's like the corn, the new crop of corn is feeding you, and like it's also creating this new fire like that's going to keep you warm.
Yeah, and this dance and the relighting is this process of purification, the offering. The women are really seen as kind of like representatives of the corn mother, right? So they're dancing in a sacred area and representing those stories, and that rebirth is the understanding that I have from these sources.
Right, and because it's, I mean, like you were saying before, it's, you start out with this, the story of the corn mother or the corn maiden, and then, that is this female entity who's made it possible to grow corn, and then it's sort of women's role to kind of maintain that agriculture, and then here, this is their part in the green corn, or one of their parts in the green corn ceremony is doing that and making sure that continues, and that they can continue to get corn and agriculture. So that's like a really powerful thing,
Yeah, it's, I mean, really like beautiful religious ceremony. Yeah, and then as the ceremony continues, you get into the third day, and that's the men's dance, where this is one of the ceremonies where the preparation of a black drink, which is common in a lot of indigenous cultures in North America. Now that the fire is lit, some of the green corn will be used to prepare this black drink, which is the sacred drink. I honestly don't have any idea what actually goes into it, but it's used in a lot of ceremonies, and it makes you vomit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's used to, like, clean out your insides. It's this, like, purifying thing. The women would also, and children you'd scratch your skin a little bit with, like, something with, like, brambles on it, and put it onto your skin. And the men would do this as well to purify your outsides as well as your insides, and then you would go to a, like, water source and clean yourself again. So it's, like a lot of cultures, this, like, purifying bath.
Right,
for
it's the idea of sort of both, like, literal cleansing and also, like both, like, bathing, but also this purification internally as well.
Yeah, and the black drink is used, and I think there might be more than one kind. I'm not totally sure about black drink, because it's one of those things that's not explained to outsiders well. So, like, the sources that we have in English, it's a lot of people being like, and then they there's this thing that they drink that looks gross and people throw up. But it's used in a lot of ceremonies and in a lot of medicine. So...
Yeah, and I mean, that makes sense to me that this is sort of like knowledge that isn't for outsiders.
Oh, yeah, definitely not.
Right? Like, that's, like, we're not supposed to know this, Devin. You don't have to apologize.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, like, so it's... I think that there might be more than one kind, because there's some that... In some other cultures, there's also a black drink that's referenced that you have in ceremonies where you might have visions and or leave your physical body. So I'm not sure what all is encompassed in this term that, like, American historians used when they say black drink. But in this situation, it's a purifying beverage that makes you expel the contents of your body. And then once the men are clean, they would perform the feather dance, which is, if you, like, are a white person Googling things, if you, like, look at, like, Oklahoma and the powwows and stuff, like, those dances with all the big feathers on them, those images, that's what we're talking about here.
Right.
But it's super, super cool. And this is, the dance that then brings the ceremony to the green corn feast. So you have the women's dance, then the men's dance, and then that day ends with the green corn feast. Yeah, and so people get to eat again.
Right.
And then the fourth...
So after you've had this fasting period.
Fasting and
then you're allowed to eat
loss
again.
And you've restarted everything and you're coming back into it, and the land has been, like, refertilized. This cycle has been brought all the way around. Then you have another feast of this fresh new corn, and then you go into day 4 where they do friendship dances and the men and women play another game of stickball, and then everything's sort of packed up and cleaned up, and you leave this sacred site and go back to life again, like everyday life is sort of
right. So it's sort of this. So, like you were saying before, though, right? There's then colonization starts to happen, and people are removed from the land, from these sacred sites. What I guess sort of, how does this type of colonization, and I guess the American state more broadly, affect this particular ceremony? If we're looking at this as sort of a microcosm of the colonial situation.
So this is a long process of essentially white European, Euro-Western communities trying to essentially eradicate a culture, and there's various ways that they did this. And there's a real focus, especially throughout the 19th century, in these Euro-Western states, the United States and Canada, of eradicating indigenous religions in particular, because it seems it's talked about as, like, assimilation, but it's really a way, something that's going to be used to control a population, right? If you remove somebody from their culture,
right,
from their language, from their understanding of how the world works, especially in a spiritual way, that's going to disconnect them not only from their family and their elders, but from the power of their community. And so the U.S. state, in the beginning, isn't necessarily explicitly involved, because you can look at the Cherokee and Creek nations and see this early process of missionaries establishing Christian schools on the nation, and like trying to teach people to read, but in order to participate at the school you have to become a Christian, which is, I think I talked about previously, the creation of the Cherokee syllabary sort of comes out of that. It's taught in some sources is speculated to be a form of resistance to that kind of indoctrination, and to those schools in particular, and was actually a particularly effective one. But you can really see the kind of like slow chipping away at the power that these ceremonies have and the power that indigenous religion has through the Indian agents and the missionaries and the policies that are adopted to criminalize, in some cases, indigenous ceremonies. You see this more commonly in the Plains nations, where the land that is controlled by the nation is greatly diminished rather than explicit removal to another place. So while you're still on parts of the land that the nation once controlled, there's explicit criminalization of ceremonial dances. The sun dance and the ghost dance of the Lakota in particular, the participation in either of those dances would result in imprisonment and all sorts of horrifying things. With the green corn dance, what happens, right, is the Trail of Tears, the removal from the land itself. So, right, what happens is, we talked about this before, I guess 2 or 3 episodes ago, where the Southeast nations are taken from their land, the land is auctioned off to white people, and they're forced to walk in the middle of winter to Oklahoma. And thousands of people die, especially older people who weren't able to, walk for thousands of miles in the middle of winter. And so you're losing a lot of the knowledge of the culture and a lot of faith in spirituality. I mean, we talk about this in the plague episode last time. When these horrifying traumatic events happen, the confidence that your spiritual actions are helping is shaken, right? And then once you get to Oklahoma, it's a radically different landscape than Georgia or the North Carolina mountains. And it's dry.
Yeah, it's a completely different
dry and arid and much colder.
Everything.
And they arrive outside of planting season. And so, you get through this horrifying, traumatic, what essentially is a death march, into a place where you're there at a time where you can't even grow food, and the American state that was supposed to provide for every single citizen of these nations did not. And so it's these period of years of starvation while they're trying to figure out how to grow on the land without help from the state and without help from the indigenous people who already lived there. Because that's the other thing that we don't talk about a lot, is that when the Cherokee and the Creek and the Seminole were removed to what was then called Indian Territory, is now known as Oklahoma, there were already indigenous nations that were living there who were also then forced off of land to make way for these other nations that were being moved there. And those people, that was essentially an invasion for them, and were not, understandably not super helpful. And the agriculture in that area was very different. So corn doesn't grow in the same way at the same time. It's a totally different place. And so to have these religious ceremonies that are so deeply connected to land to be removed from the land then greatly disrupts that. But if you do go to Oklahoma, you'll see that this practice it wasn't extinguished. The people were incredibly resilient, and actually it changed and evolved with the communication between the Creek and Cherokee nations in Oklahoma, A lot of the dances weren't necessarily practiced in the same way by the Cherokee before removal. Some of those were learned from the Creek and adopted. It's really cool. And you can look at sort of on the whole at these major ceremonial dances, which this is very different, obviously, from the sun dance and the ghost dance, but these big dances that have these incredible, powerful community-building meanings are used as resistance to the federal state, right? Like, we're going to continue to practice this no matter what you say. No matter what you do to us, we're going to do this. This is how we communicate with the world around us. This is how we understand who we are. This is how we build a community. This is how we pass on, identity. And so it is still practiced. Now, because of the, work week and things, it's usually the Thursday after the full moon of the first harvest, and it goes through the weekend.
Right.
But a really sort of screwed up thing that I found in this book that I was reading about this is that even now you see these, if they're not conscious attempts to undermine Indigenous culture, they're certainly out of touch. But these places where the festivals are being secularized and or like whitewashed. So the person who was writing the book was published about 10 years ago. And they said at the time of writing, there were preparations being made for a green corn festival in Oklahoma outside of Indigenous lands, or outside of Indigenous controlled lands. That was essentially a state fair, but was using a lot of the language and aesthetics of the green corn ceremony in its like promotion and the ways that it was going to exist. And so it's like taking that out of its cultural context is a way to really, undermine the practice itself and the power that the practice can have, as it would with any religious ceremony if we were going to have a state fair that was centered around mass or something, like it's just...
Yeah, like that's just very, very...
Yeah.
Just incredibly disrespectful. And also, I mean, not only is it, as you say, kind of this attempt to secularize it, and sort of also at the same time, is just sort of turning something that should be sacred into this, like, cheap
and it's definitely, like,
basically
crossing that line from, cultural appreciation fully into appropriation, because we're talking about this ceremony and about corn as an important staple crop in North America, and corn has become super important to Euro-Western American identity as well, and there are ways to acknowledge that and to acknowledge to integrate a recognition of like the seasons and this time and the spirituality around growing and eating corn without appropriating this practice, right? Obviously, like, Euro-Western people shouldn't be like having green corn festivals like that, but if you want to take this time to eat corn or to find historical corn recipes, like, there's a thing you can do, or to have some other kind of harvest festival.
Like, you look at, I know when I was, like, a kid, people, like, made corn husk dolls and stuff. Like, there's things you can do that aren't really, really horribly disrespectful to someone else's culture and religion, so maybe do that.
And like we said at the top of the podcast, there are just so many places where you can hear from Indigenous people talking about the culture that they practice and the way that culture is ever changing and evolving outside of these historical texts that we're talking about, because despite what the American state has tried to do in like the what is considered the worst genocide in the history of the world, the conquest of the Americas, these cultures still exist and people are still practicing it, and in a lot of cases are willing to teach other people about the culture, right? Obviously you shouldn't go somewhere and expect to be able to participate in something or even to witness it, but there are people who are talking about it and educating, Euro-Westerners or anyone around the world who wants to listen about how these cultures exist now. And it's really powerful and just, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for, learning and understanding and, getting this, like, stepping outside of your own bubble and what you're familiar with and, like, learning about how other people live and other people's traditions and religions. But yeah, as you said before, there is that line between appreciation and curiosity and wanting to learn and just outright appropriation and this, very inappropriate use of things, to put it mildly.
Yeah, and I mean, we're getting into this period of the year in our project where we're talking about harvest festivals, and certainly a lot of the European festivals were brought to America and are practiced here. But, when we were talking about, choosing harvest festivals to speak to, with you studying Europe, I wanted to take a moment to talk about the rich complexity of what we would call a religious life in, early North America, in pre-contact North America, in indigenous America continuously to today. I don't know. I think that it's important in a podcast like this to include talking about those ceremonies.
Absolutely, because I mean, as we've said,
I could be wrong.
I mean, we focus on our... Yeah, and I think, we're historians and we want to talk about ritual and folklore as, place it into its historical context and also talk about the ways that it's been used as this resistance against colonial and oppressive governments.
Yeah, which I think when we talk about the contemporary practice of the Green Corn Festival is really the power of this ceremony, that these ceremonies, the dances, the coming together of community is really how you one of the ways that you can resist this colonizer state, where the discussion of assimilation, the removal of children from families, the residential schools, which we're going to talk about in a later episode. Really the motivation behind all of that is to take people away from their culture and leave them with nothing but the colonizer, like my culture, left to them. And by ensuring that the green corn ceremony continues to happen even if you're no longer on the original land, that this can evolve and move with people, is a powerful form of resistance that I think is just super important, and that all peoples in North America should learn a bit more about.
But yeah, I think in conclusion, it's been really interesting and very, very much an eye-opener, sort of learning about how these ceremonies were practiced in, the 18th century, and the way that this sort of community religious ceremony was so tied to, the land itself, and the way that, people and communities would understand themselves specifically in relation to where they come from and the land that is providing them with the food that they need to go through this next year. And I think that's just really powerful and a very, very important thing to talk about, and how, these kinds of traditions and rituals and the bonds that they forge between community members are this very powerful tool of both of building community, but also of resistance in the face of, oppression and injustices.
Yeah. And again, remember to check out the podcast, the podcasts that I listed before that are hosted by Indigenous women. There's a whole host of new Indigenous-centered and Indigenous-created media out in the world that, if you're interested in anything that I said today, there's just so much more with people who really, really understand these practices and beliefs and cultures and are just super informed, and we should be listening to them. So go and check them out.
And that's where we're going to end it here for this week, and we'll see you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you want us to keep doing this, support us on Patreon. We have a Patreon now.
With merch!
With merch! And we'll be back next week to talk about some European things, some European harvest festivals. Gonna talk about that bread.
Yep.
Get that bread.
Next week, let's get this bread.
Okay, stay safe.
All right.
Do good work.